They were born into palaces of gold, but treated as if they didn't exist. In royal courts obsessed with perfection, the arrival of a child with Down syndrome was not seen as a blessing, but as a threat to the dynasty, to political stability, and to the carefully crafted image of royal blood as pure and untainted. Some were hidden in distant wings of castles. Others were raised in complete secrecy by hand-picked servants sworn to silence. Official portraits airbrushed them out of family history, chronicles never recorded their names, and when they died, the mourning was conducted behind locked doors. Yet, scattered among dusty archives and half-forgotten letters, their stories remain fragile, incomplete, but enough to reveal a truth that challenges the very myths of monarchy. This is the untold history of innocence born into power and erased by it. This is the hidden story of blood silence. In the centuries before medical science could name it, Down syndrome was an unspoken reality in every stratum of society, including the palaces of kings and queens. But in the rigid hierarchy of monarchy, where physical appearance and mental sharpness were equated with divine favor, the birth of a royal child with such a condition was a scandal waiting to happen. Court physicians, lacking the terminology of modern genetics, recorded these births in cryptic terms: slow of understanding, soft in visage, delicate of countenance, blessed but simple. The signs we now recognize: the almond-shaped eyes, the gentle facial structure, the unique developmental pace, were often described in language that reflected both ignorance and superstition. In medieval and Renaissance courts, a child with visible developmental differences risked being seen as an omen. The belief that the monarch's body was a mirror of the state extended to their offspring. Any perceived flaw could be interpreted as divine displeasure. And in times when dynastic succession meant survival, anything that hinted at weakness in the bloodline was treated as a state secret. One of the earliest possible cases appears in the royal records of 15th century Spain, within the household of the Trastamara dynasty. An infant prince, third son to the king, was said to be unfit for counsel or command, and was quietly placed under the care of a monastery. His name appears only once in court documents, then disappears entirely. Similar patterns can be traced in France, Austria, and several German principalities. Children mentioned briefly in baptismal registries, then absent from every public ceremony thereafter. The architecture of royal residences itself aided this concealment. Large castles often had secluded apartments known as nursery wings or upper chambers, accessible only through guarded staircases. Servants assigned to these rooms were usually imported from far-off regions, ensuring they had no local family ties to leak information. In England's Tudor court, for instance, palace household records list entire shadow staffs whose wages were paid directly from the privy purse, bypassing public accounting. These were the people entrusted with raising children who could not appear in processions or portraits. Art played its own role in erasure. Royal portraiture was a carefully curated narrative of perfection. Painters like Hans Holbein or Diego Velázquez were not just artists, they were political instruments. Any physical feature that deviated from the ideal was softened, reshaped, or omitted entirely. If a child with Down syndrome existed in the family, they were either excluded from the composition or represented symbolically as a cherub, an angel, or a background figure whose identity was never acknowledged. Behind this erasure was not just prejudice, but fear. In an age when marriage alliances were the foundation of political power, rumors of defective blood could unravel years of diplomacy. If a foreign princess learned that her prospective husband's family carried weakness, the marriage negotiations could collapse. Conversely, a king might hesitate to wed his daughter to a prince from a line rumored to have such children. Royal genealogies were therefore not just history, they were marketing brochures for dynasties, designed to present an unbroken line of health, beauty, and intelligence. Medical understanding offered no refuge. Until the 19th century, Down syndrome was not recognized as a distinct condition. Physicians lumped it with other developmental differences under broad and often cruel categories like idiocy or feeble-mindedness. This made it easier for royal families to justify removing such children from public life, claiming they were ill and needed special care away from the rigors of court. And yet, despite the secrecy, traces of love and humanity emerge from the shadows. In private letters between Queen Maria Theresa of Austria and her sister, there are hints of a tender angel, a child described as fond of music, gentle to all, and happiest in the garden. In the margins of a French duchess's prayer book, scholars have found sketches of a small boy with the soft features of Down syndrome, drawn over and over in affectionate detail. These fragments remind us that while the machinery of monarchy demanded erasure, the bonds of parenthood could not always be entirely severed. But as the centuries rolled on, the politics of secrecy would grow even more sophisticated, and the children themselves would become ghosts in the very houses they were born to inherit. If the first stage of royal concealment was omission, the second was containment. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European courts had perfected the art of hiding family members who did not fit the image of dynastic perfection. This was the age of manicured public appearances, official photography, and relentless press attention, and the stakes for concealment had never been higher. One of the most infamous examples, though rarely spoken of in official histories, comes from the Habsburg court in Vienna. In the 1800s, a child born to a branch of the imperial family exhibited the classic signs of Down syndrome. The family solution was swift. The boy was sent to a countryside estate under the guise of fragile health. Official bulletins claimed he was traveling for the air and would return when restored. He never did. His name faded from the court calendar, and by adulthood, he existed only in the whispered recollections of aging servants. Across the Channel in Britain, the Victorian obsession with moral purity and progress made such concealment even more absolute. The royal household maintained a network of private homes staffed entirely by trusted retainers. These houses, often described as grace and favor residences, served as gilded cages for children whose presence at court would provoke questions. Visitors were strictly controlled, correspondence monitored, and medical staff sworn to lifetime secrecy. Medical treatment during this era was still primitive. Down syndrome was formally described for the first time in 1866 by Dr. John Langdon Down, but understanding of it remained shallow. Physicians could now identify the condition, but without meaningful interventions, the diagnosis became another justification for exclusion. The prevailing attitude was that these children could not fulfill any public role, and thus had no place in the machinery of monarchy. Even photography, the new mirror of royalty, was carefully managed. In family portraits, any child with Down syndrome might be seated at the edge of the frame, partially turned away or blurred by long exposure. In some cases, they were represented only by an empty chair or symbolic object, such as a bouquet of flowers, said to honor an absent family member. This level of control required a culture of absolute loyalty among staff. Ladies-in-waiting, governesses, and valets were selected not only for their skills, but for their discretion. In some courts, these servants were given lifelong pensions in exchange for their silence. In others, their employment ended abruptly if the family feared they might speak out. Letters from one Prussian princess to her confidant reveal the emotional toll of this secrecy. She writes of visiting her hidden son once a month, describing his joy at seeing her, his fascination with the buttons on her gown, and the way he clung to her hand when she left. She laments that he will never be photographed, never walk in the gardens where the public might see him, never have a place in the portraits that hang in our halls. While the royal families publicly upheld the ideals of strength and perfection, these private arrangements reveal a deep fear not just of public judgment, but of vulnerability itself. For monarchs raised to believe they were chosen by God, the birth of a child with Down syndrome could feel like a divine rebuke. And so the doors remained locked, the curtains drawn, and the official story told the world that such children did not exist. By the 20th century, photography, newspapers, and later television made the total concealment of royal children far more difficult. Yet the instinct to hide them persisted well into living memory. One of the most documented cases comes from the British royal family itself. In the early 20th century, two of the Queen Mother's nieces, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, were born with developmental disabilities, possibly including Down syndrome. Official records listed them as deceased, even though both were alive and living in a residential care facility. They remained there for decades, visited rarely, and were only publicly acknowledged after their deaths, a revelation that caused public outrage. This case, while modern, follows the same centuries-old pattern: public erasure, private management, and the rewriting of family history. It also revealed the persistence of a belief that such conditions could tarnish the royal image, even in an age of supposed enlightenment. Yet alongside these stories of concealment, there emerged moments of reclamation. In certain smaller monarchies and noble houses, attitudes began to shift. Some royals quietly defied tradition, keeping children with Down syndrome at home and allowing them to participate, at least within private family life. A few even permitted photographs, though these were often kept in personal albums rather than released to the public. The change was slow, uneven, and often resisted by the older generation. But by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the rise of disability rights movements and changing public attitudes began to challenge the old logic of secrecy. In some modern royal families outside Europe, children with Down syndrome have been openly embraced, their lives celebrated rather than hidden. Still, the historical record remains fractured. Centuries of deliberate erasure mean that many names are lost forever, their stories scattered in private letters, medical logs, and estate inventories. What survives is often indirect: a servant's diary entry about a gentle prince who loved the gardens, a governess's letter describing the sweetest of tempers, or an unexplained name on a payroll list for a nursery companion. These fragments form a ghostly counter-history of monarchy, one in which the crown's obsession with perfection was built on silencing its most vulnerable members. For every celebrated heir who wore the crown, there may have been a brother or sister kept from public view, a life lived in quiet rooms, their existence denied but never entirely erased from the hearts of those who love them. Today, as historians and archivists revisit the private papers of royal families, more of these stories are emerging. They challenge the official portraits, revealing a truth that is both more human and more tragic: that behind the grandeur of the crown were children who bore no guilt, yet paid the price for a system that valued image over truth. And so the untold history of royal children with Down syndrome is not just about the cruelty of concealment, but about the resilience of memory. Even in the silence imposed by palaces, traces of their laughter, their presence, and their love survived, and now, centuries later, they are finally beginning to be heard. History is often written by those who have something to hide. The children in this story did not hold power, command armies, or decide the fate of nations, yet they shaped the private worlds of kings and queens, and their absence shaped the myths of monarchy. If you want to uncover more of the truths hidden behind royal walls, keep watching, because the next secret may change everything you thought you knew about the crown.